What's going on, everyone? This is Eric coming at you from just outside Hartford, Connecticut, with today being our second installment of the History of series. If you don't know much about what our History of series is, we do have a video which was posted last Friday titled, What is the History of Series? Basically, real quick rundown of what it is. It's basically going to be discussing every team in the NHL, MLB, and NFL, when they started, if they started as another team, and all that good stuff. And we're going to discuss them from when they were founded to the end of their runs or to present day. Some teams will be longer videos than others, and yeah, we will not be really focusing all that much on single individual players, but we will discuss certain players. We will mention certain players. We just won't spend all that much time talking about, say, Babe Ruth in the Yankees video or Zdeno Chara in the Bruins video. Now, today is going to be the first installment of the History of series for the NHL. Our last video was about the Minnesota Twins, which of course is an MLB team. Today's video is going to be about the Boston Bruins. So, without further ado, we're just going to jump right into it. And I do apologize if I mispronounce any names, and I do apologize if I take a short, 5-second break. I do have a little bit of a sore throat right now. I don't know if you can really tell, but I do have water with me, so if I do take a break or pause for a second, I do apologize for that. I'm here for you guys. I promised a video today. We're getting our video today. But without further ado, we're finally going to jump right in. So, in the 1920s, the NHL wasn't what it is today. The NHL was only a couple teams here and there. We're really going to discuss the history of the NHL when we do the Montreal Canadiens video. And again, more so with the Ottawa Senators, the original Ottawa Senators franchise. So it was mostly just a Canadian organization. So calling it the National Hockey League was kind of like, But again, national doesn't mean American. It just means national. So, or Canadian, I should say. So basically, not a lot of teams were in the United States. So in November of 1924, Charles Adams was granted the rights to an NHL franchise. And he decided to place said team in the Massachusetts city of Boston. The Boston team would become the NHL's first American stateside franchise. So Adams hired a former player in Art Ross to become the franchise's coach, general manager, and vice president. Now, Art Ross was a well-known name in the NHL circles. Everybody knew who he was, and he was definitely a well-respected guy. And hiring Art Ross was a very, very, very smart move. Giving him all that power might have been questionable, but would it pay off? So Ross came up with the nickname of Bruins, and if you don't know, a Bruin is another nickname for a bear. So that's why if you look at the old Bruins logos, secondary logos, you'll see the bear logo. That's what a Bruin is. And it's really funny because at this point last week, when I was recording the Minnesota Twins video, a actual bear, a brown bear, walked by my property, and I saw it. And, that's what kind of got me thinking, maybe I should do the Bruins for this week. So if he makes a visit today, I will definitely make sure to post a picture of him because it's pretty dang cool. Anyway, that's enough of that. Back into the history. So, the team would play its home games when it started at the Boston Arena. Interesting fact about the Boston Arena. The Boston Arena is actually still in use today. Now, it's not used by the Boston Bruins, but it is used by a college hockey team. I believe Northeastern plays its games there. So it is the oldest stadium in North America that is still being used for hockey. So that's pretty cool. That's pretty dang cool. So many Canadian teams and skaters, I should say, were uneasy about playing in the United States. So the Bruins were kind of stuck with NHL castaways right away. A lot of these guys who kind of knew Art Ross from when they were playing, and they were kind of like, oh, hey, yeah, Art's a good guy. You know what? He's going to give me a shot to play, so I'll play. And a couple younger players were kind of like, you know what? Sure. Like the younger guys that weren't top tier targets for the Canadian teams. So they went to the Bruins. So on December 1st, 1924, the Bruins beat the Montreal Maroons 2-1 in their first ever game. Their first ever goal was scored by a speedy left winger named Smokey Harris. On December 8th, they would play their first ever game against the Montreal Canadiens. And in case you don't know, the Canadiens and the Bruins would become some of the most fierce rivals in NHL history, despite the rivalry being one of the most one-sided rivalries, at least in the beginning to the middle. Present day has been more even, more leaning towards the other side, but we'll get to that in a little bit. So Boston finished to the season with a 6-24 record, with a .200 winning percentage. Now, obviously, as an expansion team, that's not horrible. That's not good, but that's not horrible, especially back then when an expansion draft wasn't a thing. The Bruins improved dramatically for their second season, going 17-15-4, but missed out on the playoffs. Again, I said I wasn't going to really discuss records, but I just wanted to show the big jump that they made in year 1 to year 2. So they acquired defenseman Eddie Shore prior to the 1926 season. The Bruins actually went and made the Stanley Cup in the 1926-27 season, but fell short to the old Ottawa Senators franchise. They purchased the contract of defenseman Dick Clapper before the 1927-28 season, and they converted him to a right wing, which wasn't a bad move at all. The move ends up working out for him and everybody else involved. So, before the 1928-29 season, the Bruins purchased the goaltender Tiny Thompson. Again, another move that would work out for them. In November of 1928, the Bruins moved to the brand new Boston Garden. The Bruins would go 26-13-5 in the 28-29 season, clinching a playoff berth. The Bruins would win the Stanley Cup that year versus the New York Rangers in a 2-0 series sweep. Now, back then, the Stanley Cup finals were kind of, there wasn't that concrete, okay, it must be one in a best of 7. It was kind of like, okay, well, it's just going to be a home and home, and yeah, if we have to go to, it's going to be a best of 3, home and home. Game 3 would go to the team with the better record, and that's how old school hockey was. They didn't do best of 7, it was best of 3. So, congratulations to the Bruins. You won a Stanley Cup early on. The 1929-1930 Bruins set NHL records. The team went 38-5-1, ending the regular season with an unheard of .875 winning percentage. And they unfortunately for them though, I should say, they did not win the Stanley Cup despite having this great season, a great regular season, as they fell to the Montreal Canadiens. So, in this time frame, the Bruins actually made 3 Stanley Cups as an expansion team. They made 3 Stanley Cups in the decade they were founded. And they won one of them with the 1928-1929 season. It's just insane that they made 3 Stanley Cups in the decade they were founded. Maybe other teams will do it, but, that's just crazy to me. So here we are in the 1930s. At this point, the Bruins begin the new decade with a bang, and they win 28 games. On March 26, 1931, the Bruins became the first team to pull their goalie in favor of a 6th skater, a 6th attacker. Although the Bruins would lose the game, this tactic became mainstream shortly after. It's kind of crazy that nobody had thought to do it beforehand, but at the same time, hockey is still today, to an extent, a gentleman's game, as you see with restricted free agents. So it's not the most surprising thing that nobody had thought to pull the goalie for a sixth attacker. Anyway, the Bruins regressed slightly that season, or the next season, 31-32, winning only 15 games. But in the 32-33 season, they would make the playoffs, but lost in the semifinals. So on December 12th, 1933, Bruins defenseman Eddie Shore effectively ended Maple Leafs star right wing Ace Bailey's career with a dirty hit. So this kind of put a little bit of a mark on Eddie Shore, and people would kind of try to hit him back, but it didn't work out as much as they'd hoped. But at this point, it was one of the more well-known hits at this point, so people were not fans of Eddie Shore, except for Boston, of course. And Toronto, it kind of started a rivalry between Toronto and Boston, but that rivalry, wasn't too much of anything. So, following a weaker 33-34 season, in which the Bruins won 18-25-5, Art Ross actually steps down as the coach to focus on being a general manager instead. In the 35-36 season, we saw the NHL debut of left wing Woody Dumart, and the debut of center Bill Cowley. After a tough loss to the Maple Leafs in the playoffs that season, rumors began swirling that the Bruins coach, Frank Patrick, was constantly drunk and could not control the team. He was fired after the 2 seasons, and Art Ross stepped in again as the role as coach. In the 36-37 season, the Bruins saw the NHL debut of center Milt Schmidt and right wing Bobby Orr, who, with left wing Woody Dumart, would form the feared offensive line nicknamed the Kraut Line, as all 3 players have German descent. I liked when I learned that fact. As a German myself, German American, I should say, as myself. Pretty dang cool. So, the 37-38 Bruins played well but lost in the semifinals. 38-39 season started off with Tiny Thompson getting hurt in an exposition game, so the Bruins called up a minor leaguer named Frank Brimsek, who played well. So what the Bruins ended up doing is trading Tiny Thompson in November, which gave Brimsek the starting role, full possession of the starting role. The 38-39 Bruins had the best record in the NHL, and Art Ross was named Coach of the Year. The Bruins defeated the Maple Leafs 4-1 in the Stanley Cup final to hoist up their second Stanley Cup. So Ross, again, following this season, steps down as the head coach to focus on his GM duties. And the team would end up trading defenseman Eddie Shore in January of 1940, and the team lost in the semifinals to end off the 1930s decade. And yes, I did just say 1940. How I'm doing hockey is I should have specified it. I group the season into the decade in which it started. So the 1939-1940 season is grouped into the 30s. Thusly, like the 2019-2020 season is grouped in the 2010s. But in the 1930s, the Bruins went to one Stanley Cup, and they won it, which was the 38-39 season. 1940s come into play now, and the Bruins started off the 40s strong, with a league-leading 27-8-13 record. Now, when I say 27-8-13, I mean 27 wins, 8 losses, 13 ties at this point in time. It wasn't until relatively recently that the NHL abolished ties and made it, you go into overtime, you go into the shootout, which shootouts are a whole different story. We can discuss that in another video. But so the Bruins end up sweeping the Detroit Red Wings in the Stanley Cup. So their head coach ends up resigning following the Cup, and Art Ross, for the 3rd time, steps in again to become the Bruins head coach. During World War II, the Bruins lost some of their best players, including the whole Kraut Line and Brimsek, to fight in World War II. A lot of teams lost a lot of players. So, unfortunately, the Bruins were not an exception. And unfortunately for these guys, they lost some of the best years of their careers. But I don't think they would change it any day because, fighting to serve your country, especially back then, was such an honor. So, they had no problem with it. So, despite this, the team actually remained competitive, and they lost in the semifinals in the 41-42 season, and they lost in the Stanley Cup the following season. The Bruins fell to below 500 for the first time in a decade in the 43-44 season, as the losses finally began to catch up with them, and they missed the playoffs for the first time in that decade. Following a rough 1944-45 season, Art Ross again stepped down as coach, but this time it was for the last time. He did not get the coaching role back. And Dick Clapper stepped into a little bit more of a player manager role as he was getting older, his skills were declining. Clapper, aided by the return of his stars from the war, led the Bruins to a 45-46 Stanley Cup Finals appearance where they fell to the Montreal Canadiens, 4-1. In February of 1947, Dick Clapper retired as a player, but hung around as the manager. So he was no longer the player manager, he was just the head coach. In 1946-47, right wing Johnny Pearson makes his debut, and Bill Cowley ends up retiring following the 46-47 season. They lost in the semifinals for 3 straight seasons, 46-47, 47-48, and 48-49. So they were a good team, but they weren't good enough to get far. Their stars were getting a little older, and their youngsters weren't good enough to carry the team yet. So following the 48-49 season, Dick Clapper actually ends up resigning as the team's coach, and longtime goalie Frank Brimsek, I keep saying Brismek, I apologize for that, Brimsek, ends up getting traded to the Chicago Blackhawks after the season per his own request. And it was because he wanted to be closer to his parents. One of his parents wasn't feeling well, so he wanted to be back closer to home because I believe his family lived right in the Chicago area. So, of course, the Bruins honored his request. They said, you know what? Yeah, definitely, we can do that for you. He was almost done in his career at this point. The guy's, going to be a Hall of Famer. Just give him what he wants. It makes you look better as an organization. So they ended the decade with a weak 1949-1950 season. It is what it is. But yeah, so in the 40s, the Bruins made 3 Stanley Cups, and they won one of them in the 1940-1941 season. So for those of you keeping track, the Bruins have made 7 Stanley Cups in their existence up to this point, and they have won 3 of them, 1 in each decade. So the Bruins, they're not exactly the best team in the NHL, but they're a damn good one. They're making a run for the best American team by far. Well, other than the Blackhawks. And the Red Wings. Anyway, here we are in the 1950s. So the team hires Lynn Patrick as the head coach prior to the 1950-51 season. In 1951, the Bruins were sold to the Celtics owner, Walter Brown. And before you question me, I'm a history guy. It's not Celtics, it's Celtics. I will say Celtics when I have to. So that is not me mispronouncing, trust me. Bobby Bauer, who hadn't played in Boston since the 46-47 season, plays one last game with them in the 51-52 season, scoring a goal before retiring. He had basically been going down to the minors and going to other leagues and all that, and just not really focusing on NHL hockey. So he played the one last game, he scored a goal, he retires. Kraut Line is no longer a thing. They lost one of their 3 players. He was the first, like I said, of the Kraut Line to retire. So the Bruins made the Stanley Cup in the 52-53 season, but lost 4-1 to, surprise, surprise, Les Canadiens. After the 53-54 season, Woody Dumart left the Bruins and played a handful of games in the AHL. He would retire shortly thereafter. On January 1st, 1954, the Bruins ordered a Zamboni, and they were the first team to acquire a Zamboni themselves. And that Zamboni is still on display. It's not used anymore. It was used for a while, but it is still on display. You can see it, which is pretty cool. You can see the first NHL Zamboni. And for those of you who don't know what a Zamboni is, the Zamboni is the thing that they put on the ice to clear up the ice during, the first intermission, second intermission, and certain points in the, before the overtime period, before shootouts. And if there's like an extended delay in the game, they'll do it as well. It's just that little machine. They're cool. In October of 1954, General Manager Art Ross retires. So the coach Lynn Patrick ends up taking over as GM. Midway through the 54-55 season, Patrick handed over his coaching role to Milt Schmidt, who effectively retired from playing once offered the head coach role. His retirement meant the end of an era for the Bruins, as most of their well-known players from the 30s and, early 40s were gone, retired, on to other things. But at least Milt was still on the team, granted as coach. Schmidt had successful teams to close out the 50s. Now, these teams were built on a strong offense. They made the Stanley Cup in the 56-57 and 57-58 seasons, but lost them both times to the Canadiens. I told you this rivalry was one-sided to start off. Both times they lost the Cups 4-1 and 4-2, so it wasn't exactly close, but... So prior to the 1957-58 season, the Bruins acquired left wing Johnny Bourque from Detroit. So on January 18th, 1958, Willie O'Ree makes his NHL debut for the Bruins, and he was the first black player in the NHL. Pretty cool that, the Bruins were the team to have him. He will definitely be getting his own video at some point. So when we do player bios, you will be hearing about him, Willie O'Ree. I do just want to say he was recently, I think it was in 2018, inducted into the Hall of Fame as a builder, because he wasn't exactly this red-hot player who set the league on fire. But, not bad at all. Not bad at all. He definitely deserves it. He is still alive today. So, respect to Willie O'Ree. Following the 57-58 season, right wing Pearson retired. He would go on to have a career as a broadcaster and color analyst for the Bruins for a good chunk of time. So if you're an older fan of the Bruins, you definitely know who Pearson is. So they end up missing the playoffs in the 59-60 season, which led them to, close out the decade kind of weakly. But they made 3 Stanley Cups in the 1950s. Unfortunately, they lost all 3 of them. So here we are in the 1960s. The new decade started off with a whimper for the Bruins as the team failed to win more games. Really, just struggling. They hung around. They were below 500 all these years for a while in the 60s. It was a completely different era for them at this point. The Bruins were struggling, okay? The Bruins were struggling. They couldn't win more games than they lost. So they were not what they were. In 1960-61, Willie O'Ree appears in a career-high 43 games for the Bruins, scoring 4 goals and 10 assists. This, coupled with the 2 games he played in the 57-58 season, would make up the entirety of his NHL career. Again, remember, people weren't exactly thrilled about having a black player on their team. People would try to deliver hits on Willie O'Ree, and America was still extremely racist at that point. Jim Crow laws are still in effect. So nobody was really excited about him. He was actually blinded in one eye because of a vicious hit. So, congratulations. As you can tell with those stats, he wasn't exactly this elite guy, but he was still a good player. So the team would sign right wing Tommy Williams prior to the 1961-62 season. He was the only American player in the NHL, American born, United States of America, born player in the NHL, for a majority of his career, just because, again, teams didn't really want Americans. Americans weren't the best. Americans were just there. Canadians were the players that you wanted. Canadians were the majority of the league at this point. So in 1964, owner Walter Brown dies, and former owner and son of Bruins founder Charles Weston Adams ends up buying the team again, or buying the team. Continuing his father's legacy from a while ago. So GM Lynn Patrick leaves in 1964, and in 1964-65, left wing Wayne Cashman debuts for the Bruins. So now you're starting to get some changes, and these changes are good. These changes are starting to look good for the team. But the biggest changes had yet to come. So in 65-66, the Bruins would acquire goaltender Jerry Cheevers. And here's a big one. October 19th, 1966, defenseman Bobby Orr makes his NHL debut for the Bruins. Oh, there's stuff about him, and he's a really good player. But you'll see that shortly. Don't you worry. Don't you worry. So the Bruins would struggle in the 66-67 season, winning only 17 out of 70 games. So 1-7 wins out of 7-0 games played. Not good. Not good. Now, before the 1967-68 season, the Bruins would acquire center Phil Esposito, right wing Ken Hodge, and wing, because he was both a left and a right wing, Fred Stamford from the Chicago Blackhawks. This trade was known as one of the most one-sided trades in NHL history, obviously in the Bruins' favor. The Bruins, led by an extremely talented core, would make the Stanley Cup. My apologies. They would make the playoffs. Sorry. My apologies. They would make the playoffs in the 67-68 season, which ended their, the end of their rebuild. And 68-69, they also made the playoffs. After the 68-69 season, Tommy Williams left the team. Now, the Bruins, led by an extremely talented core, would make the Stanley Cup, where they would sweep the St. Louis Blues in the 69-70 season, which is where we get that iconic photo of Bobby Orr, scoring the game-winning goal, flying through the air with his arms in the air. That's where we get that from. Bobby Orr was the Bruins that season, and he won the James Norris Memorial Trophy, which was Best Defenseman, the Art Ross Trophy, League Leader in points, the Hart Memorial Trophy, which is the regular season MVP, and the Conn Smythe Trophy, which is the playoffs MVP. He really was the Bruins that year. This was his team. He was the Boston Bruins. Yeah. So, in the 1960s, the Bruins made the one Stanley Cup, and they won it in 1969-1970. So, at this point, the Bruins are still a successful franchise. They're not the best franchise in the league, but they're a successful one. Now, we enter the 1970s. The 1970-71 season, the Bruins were really a force on offense, and they housed 7 of the top 10 scorers in the league, points-wise, or goals-wise. They also had 4 players score 100-plus points in the season, which was unprecedented at that time in the NHL. The Bruins were heavy favorites to repeat as Stanley Cup champions, but they fell to the rival Montreal Canadiens in the quarterfinals. In the 1971-72 season, right wing Terry O'Reilly makes his NHL debut for the Bruins, and the Bruins would go on to defeat the rival New York Rangers in a 4-2 series in the Stanley Cup that year. And they were really, again, carried by Bobby Orr. This led to Rangers defenseman Brad Park commenting that, quote, Bobby Orr didn't make the difference, end quote, in that Stanley Cup. So, at this point, everybody knows this is Bobby Orr's team. Bobby Orr is the guy who is doing everything. In the 1972-73 season, the Bruins lost some key players to the WHA, or the World Hockey Association, which was a new league that was founded to help, recreate hockey in cities that weren't exactly popular in the NHL. Like, let's just use some examples here. Let's just say right now you were to do it, you'd probably have a team in Atlanta. You could possibly have a team in Hartford, Connecticut. Of course, bias there, but Quebec City. Teams that had NHL teams and still have an interest in hockey, but don't have an NHL team, like I said. So that essentially that's what the WHA would be today. You'd have a bunch of teams like those, Houston, cities that want teams, but don't have interest in having teams move to them at this point. So the WHA started to hurt a lot of teams, and it forced teams into paying larger contracts, because now this new start hockey league was beginning to throw more money at players, specifically older veterans with name recognition, because they were worth more. So the Bruins would end up losing goaltender Gary Cheevers to the WHA. Towards the end of the season, the Bruins were sold to Storied Broadcasting. The Bruins lost to the Rangers in the quarterfinals that season. Following the 72-73 season, the Bruins would trade forward Fred Stanford to the Minnesota North Stars. The Bruins made the 73-74 Stanley Cup, but they would lose the Stanley Cup to the first non-original six franchise that won the Stanley Cup in the Philadelphia Flyers. I had to make that point. You guys know I was going to make that point. Broad Street Bullies, baby. So what they do is they hire Don Cherry to be the head coach before the 1974-1975 season. We all know who Don Cherry is. It had to be mentioned. So they began to play a physical hockey game under Don Cherry and signed numerous enforcers. So Cheevers would actually return to the Bruins in the late 1975-1976 season from the WHA. So he comes back. He was missed. And the Bruins themselves were actually sold in this time frame to a new owner in Jeremy Jacobs. In late November 1975, the Bruins traded center Phil Esposito to the Rangers for defenseman Brad Park and center Gene Rattel. Now, yes, this is the same Brad Park that had very high things to say of, his former rival Bobby Orr. Now, the Bruins lost to the Flyers in the semifinals that year, and in May of 1976, it was a significant month for the Bruins. Longtime defenseman Bobby Orr, who had battled through knee injury after knee injury, he signs a deal with the Chicago Blackhawks. His knees betrayed him, though, and he was never the same player. So at this point, Bobby Orr, while he was the Bruins, is not anymore. The Bruins also sent right wing Ken Hodge to the New York Rangers. So now a lot of their well-known players are gone. Every player that they traded when they fleeced the Blackhawks is gone. Bobby Orr is gone. And these guys were all stars to start the decade. Here we are in 1976, they're all gone. Again, Don Cherry wanted enforcers. He didn't necessarily care about these fancy goal scorers that wouldn't drop gloves. 76-77 Bruins fell to the Canadiens in the Stanley Cup. Yet again, the Canadiens defeated the Bruins in the Stanley Cup. The 1977-78 Bruins were again an offensive force despite Don Cherry really signing all these enforcers. And it saw 11 players each score 20-plus goals. They again fell to the Montreal Canadiens in the Stanley Cup. For those of you keeping track, I think that's 5 or 6 losses to the Canadiens in the Stanley Cup compared to 0 wins. Not much of a rivalry, Boston fans, at this point. Left wing Johnny Bourque retires after the season. The 78-79 Bruins fell to the Montreal Canadiens in the semifinals. Don Cherry was fired following this loss. Now, he wasn't fired because they lost in the semifinals. He was not fired because of that. Don Cherry, as we know today, makes very controversial comments. He makes bad choices. He's not the brightest, he's not the brightest. So he can irritate people. So he would get under the skin of the general managers and the owners. So he really annoyed general manager, the owner, and a lot of the players. So they kind of said, if he's staying, I'm going. And, seeing as he had yet to bring the Bruins a Stanley Cup title, the owner said, fine, he's gone. I don't want Don Cherry here anymore anyway. He's annoyed me too much. So in the 1979-1980 season, defenseman Ray Bourque makes his debut for the Bruins. On December 23rd, 1979, there was a very, very, very controversial, infamous, I should say, moment in Bruins history. There's videos of this, so I definitely recommend Googling it. This is another one of those little side stories where I'm doing a history of. They happen sometimes. I like to mention the infamous moments in the team's history because they're kind of fun. So, basically, the Bruins were playing the Rangers on the road at Madison Square Garden. So, towards the end of the game, Bruins were winning, and defenseman Ray Bourque, who at this point is a rookie, nobody really knows who he is. He attempts an empty netter, but ends up getting denied by a Rangers player. So, first of all, whatever. There's nothing too major about that. Of course, nowadays, if you attempt an empty netter, nobody cares. The net's empty for a reason. But something was said, and, it just upset people. So, Phil Esposito ends up getting the puck. The current Ranger, Phil Esposito, former Bruin, ends up getting the puck on a breakaway, and it's denied by goaltender Cheevers. And the Bruins would bleed out the clock, holding on to win the game 4-3. Esposito was very frustrated that, he got denied by the goalie on a breakaway. He would break his stick in complete disgust and went into the locker room. You could see him on the video. He breaks his stick and just kind of stomps into the locker room. Nobody followed him, though. He was the only guy to go in the locker room. So, players from both teams met on the ice and the words were exchanged. Refs began to, try to defuse the situation, but a Rangers fan grabbed Bruins left wing Stan Jonathan's stick from him and began to hit him with it. So the Bruins saw this. They were not happy, and they were still full of enforcers because remember, Don Cherry was recently the coach of this team. The Bruins had guys that were willing to fight. So they sprung into action. Now Terry O'Reilly hops into the stands and fought the fan. He literally starts grabbing the fan, throwing punches at him. He's not throwing weak punches. He's punching him in the face. Punching this guy in the face. Oh my gosh. It's just like, today this would never happen, but this is a different time. So other fans would get involved. And because they're like, hey, you can't fight our fan. What did he do? You guys are just sore winners. So other fans tried to get into it. So this prompted other Bruins players into jumping over and getting into the stands as well. So center Peter McNabb hikes up a few more rows and wrestles another fan who was really talking garbage to the ground. A defenseman, Mike Milbury, who we know today as an NHL announcer, wanted to join in, and he rips off the fan that McNabb tackles down. He rips off the guy's shoe and starts hitting him with it. So there's actually a pretty funny interview you can watch with Milbury talking about the incident where he's like, yeah, I wanted to get involved and I saw a shoe just kind of there. So I grabbed the shoe and I took it and I started hitting the guy with it. I beat him with his own shoe. So soon enough, the cops were there and the actual police were there, and no fans wanted to get their butts kicked by NHL players, so nobody really wanted to fight, so the fans were all running away, and the players kind of realized, oh my god, this escalated quickly. So it gets cleared up. So O'Reilly receives an 8-game suspension. McNabb and Milbury each get 6-game suspensions, but that was it for the suspension factor, surprisingly. So every single Bruins player, except Gary Cheevers, was fined $500 for the incident. And that was it. That's all that happened. That was it. So just imagine that today. It's not going to happen that way. Sorry, guys. You jump into the stands, you're done. Your career's over. Oh, my gosh. Gary Cheevers ends up retiring after the 1979-1980 season. Because remember, he'd been around for a while. And yeah, he did take a little break, but he went to the WHA. So it's not like he was just sitting there doing nothing. So the Bruins would make 4 Stanley Cups in the 1970s. And they won one of them in the 71-72 season. 1980s come into play. And the Bruins really spent the 80s as a great team, but not an elite team. So they were constantly competing for the Stanley Cup, but they couldn't do enough. They couldn't win anything. It was so weird to write great but not elite, because normally it's good but not great. Or bad but not awful, It's never great but not elite. So center Gene Jean Rattel retires after the 1980-81 season. So the 82-83 Bruins finish with a 50, 20, and 10 record with 110 points, which was the best record in hockey. However, they fell to the New York Islanders in the Eastern Conference Final. At this point, the Islanders were definitely a force in hockey. So they really were kind of the team that stopped the Bruins from being an elite team at this point. After the season, left wing Wayne Cashman retires, and defenseman Brad Park leaves the team in free agency. The Bruins again won their division, but fell in the first round of the playoffs to the Montreal Canadiens, because why not? Why not rub more salt in the wound, Bruins fans? So the 84-85 team regressed, but still made the playoffs, and yet again fell to Les Canadiens. Allez les Canadiens. Congratulations, Canadiens. At this point, they're still the best, they're still arguably the best team in sports. They still have the most championships. But, times are a-changing. But still got the Bruins number at this point in time. So right wing Terry O'Reilly retires after the season. And before this 86-87 season, the Bruins trade for right wing Cam Neely from the Vancouver Canucks. The 1987-88 Bruins would make the Stanley Cup, but they got swept by Wayne Gretzky's Edmonton Oilers. In 1988-89, defenseman Don Sweeney makes his debut for the Bruins, and the Bruins would again make the Stanley Cup, but again lost to the Edmonton Oilers. However, they were able to snag a game from the Oilers, losing the series 4-1. The Bruins would make the 2 Stanley Cups in the 1980s, but lost both of them to the Edmonton Oilers. Things were definitely looking up for the Bruins at this point, though. So the 1990s now come into play. And this is where I started recognizing pretty much, more and more names as the decade starts to progress. Because, I was born in the 90s, and my parents aren't really hockey fans, so I kind of started to follow myself in the early 2000s, the mid 2000s. So I start knowing some of these bigger names easily without having to do any research on them. But the Bruins had another strong season in the 90-91 season, but they fell to the Pittsburgh Penguins in the Eastern Conference Finals. Again, the Bruins were just good. They had these great teams, but the playoffs are different. The playoffs don't care if you have the top team in the league. They care about who your top players are, because that's who steps in. That's who makes your playoffs matter. So they would acquire center Adam Oates in February of 1992, and they again fell to the Penguins in the 91-92 Eastern Conference Final. So the Bruins are just not getting lucky. They're falling to all these dynasties. They're peaking at the wrong time. So the 92-93 Bruins were the best Bruins team of the decade, finishing 51-26-7. But the team fell flat come playoff time, getting swept in the first round by the Buffalo Sabres. Now, I could insert a joke here saying the Sabres are, that's the last time the Sabres made the playoffs. But I'm not going to do that because Buffalo fans have enough problems to worry about. So, the Bruins slowly began to age, and the team was still competitive, however. They continued to make the playoffs year after year, but struggled to get past the second round of the playoffs. After the 94-95 season, the Bruins would actually leave the Boston Garden, their well-known stadium, as the Garden was starting to show its age. They moved to the newly constructed Fleet Center, which is where they still play today, albeit the Fleet Center has a different name, which we will get to shortly. Following the 95-96 season, right wing Cam Neely played his last game in the NHL. Center Joe Thornton makes his NHL debut in the 97-98 season. And before that, center Adam Oates was traded to the Washington Capitals in March of 1997, ending his time as a Bruin. So the 96-97 Bruins mustered only 61 points in 82 games, which ended their playoff streak of 29 seasons. The team was good, but not a cup contender to close out the millennium. And we have another one of our infamous history moments in Bruins history. On February 21st, the year of our Lord 2000, Bruins enforcer Marty McSorley whacks Vancouver's enforcer Donald Brashear in the back of the head with a stick. So Brashear's head ends up hitting the ice, and he suffers a grade 3 concussion and is just dealing with a lot of problems. He's unconscious. He's slipping in and out of consciousness. If there is a video of this. If you have a weak stomach, I definitely would not recommend watching the video because they do show Brashear kind of having medical issues. There is no blood, but they do show Brashear kind of having medical issues. But if you do want to watch the video, I will not link it just because if you have a weak stomach, you don't want to watch it. But it is an interesting video. McSorley ends up getting suspended for the rest of the season after this. And since this game ended up taking place in Canada, the Canadian government took McSorley to court for assault with a weapon. And he was found guilty of assault with a weapon. And he was sentenced to 18 months probation. So this incident effectively ended his NHL career, as at this point he was already nearing the end of his career. Brashear was kind of more up and coming. But, they were both still enforcers who would chirp all the time. This brought a lot of negative attention to the Bruins, of course, because now at this point, people who were, kind of uneasy with the Bruins hated them because it's like, hey, this is the team of thugs that ended, Ace Bailey's career with Eddie Shore's vicious hit. And now this guy's doing this too. This is garbage. The Canadian teams are done with the Bruins. They hated them, and they would hate them even more in Vancouver. But, so in March of 2000, the Bruins would trade defenseman Ray Bourque to the Colorado Avalanche for a last chance to compete for a Stanley Cup. As in the 1990s, the Bruins did not get a Stanley Cup. They did not make one, and they did not win one. So they would they would sign defenseman Paul Coffey for the last season of his career, his historic career, in the year of 2000-2001. So the Bruins are they traded Ray Bourque for Paul Coffey. Interesting. Coffey's got an interesting career. He actually was traded to the Hartford Whalers at one point and refused to play. So he got pissed off that he was traded, and he played a few games, but then gets traded again. So that was interesting when I looked at his career. I didn't know that. So the Bruins would again, despite the addition of Paul Coffey, miss the playoffs in 2000-2001. However, the Avalanche won the Cup. So this meant that the longtime Bruins defenseman Ray Bourque had won a Stanley Cup. So Bourque ends up bringing the Cup to Boston, and there's a huge celebration for him just because everybody loved him in Boston. Nobody cared that he won with the Avalanche. They just wanted him to win the Stanley Cup. He got the Cup. There was plenty of tears involved when he brought the Cup to Boston. It meant a lot to everybody there. He would retire shortly after, though, so he ended his career on top. The Bruins would make the playoffs the next 3 seasons, but they never really made noise in the playoffs. Goaltender Tim Thomas would make his NHL debut in the 2002-2003 season. Defenseman Don Sweeney leaves the team after the 2002-2003 season to play for the Dallas Stars. Center Patrice Bergeron makes his NHL debut in 2002-2003, and in the 04-05 season is canceled due to a lockout. So, Bergeron's on the team now. Congratulations. Season's done. There's no season this year. Bruins probably didn't lose much. I mean, they weren't one of the better teams in the league at that point. So it is what it is. The Fleet Center is renamed to the TD Bank North Garden in January of 05. The only real action that happened with the Bruins during that time frame. The team would trade center Joe Thornton, Jumbo Joe, to the San Jose Sharks before the 05-06 season, as Thornton just didn't, he wasn't producing. He wasn't showing leadership that the team wanted him to, so they were kind of like, okay, we don't need you then. So the Bruins would ink defenseman Brian Leetch to a 1-year deal. He'd retire after the season, though. So again, the Bruins signed another veteran defenseman in the 2000s to a 1-year deal. In the summer of 2006, it was a very eventful summer for the Bruins. They would acquire the rights to goaltender Tuukka Rask in June from the Toronto Maple Leafs, as they traded a established, decent goaltender to the Maple Leafs, who were in a win-now mood, for the rights to some Finnish goaltender who may or may not come back overseas. So it was a high-risk, high-reward move for the Bruins, and a low-risk, low-reward move for the Maple Leafs. Obviously, it worked out for the Bruins more than Maple Leafs, but hindsight's 20/20. They then would sign defenseman Zdeno Chara in July of 2006. Now, here we are, and in the 06-07 season, center David Krejci makes his NHL debut, as does right wing Phil Kessel. Yeah, some people might be saying, wait, Phil Kessel was a Bruin? Yes, he was. He was drafted by the Bruins. It's one of those weird things that nobody really remembers. They would hire Claude Julien as the head coach before the 07-08 season. And in this time frame, Milan Lucic, left wing Milan Lucic, would make his debut in early 2007. Or in the early 2007-2008 season, I should say. Tuukka Rask makes his NHL debut the next month in November of 2007. So they lost in the semifinals in the 08-09 season. In October of 2009, left wing Brad Marchand makes his NHL debut. They trade right wing Phil Kessel to the Toronto Maple Leafs in September of 2009 for draft picks, two of which would become impact players named center Tyler Seguin and defenseman Dougie Hamilton. Wait, hang on. Okay. I missed in July of 2009. The TD North Bank Garden was just renamed TD Bank North Garden was renamed to TD Garden. It was just shortened. So the Bruins blew a 3-0 series lead to the Flyers in the 2009-2010 playoffs, being the first NHL team to blow a 3-0 playoff series lead. I can tell you exactly where I was when the Flyers came back to win that game. That's a story for another day. Game 7, I should say. The Bruins did not appear in any Stanley Cups that decade. But here we are in the 2010s. And the Bruins are back. So center Tyler Seguin makes his debut in October of 2010. The Bruins have a strong 2010-2011 season as they push their way through the playoffs. They finally end their Stanley Cup drought, beating the Vancouver Canucks, causing the city of Vancouver to riot with a very close Stanley Cup. On paper, very close Stanley Cup 4-3, but if you watch that Game 7, it wasn't close. Bruins slaughtered them. Goaltender Tim Thomas announced he would sit out the 2012-2013 season, and it kind of marked the end of his career. Because when he made his debut a decade earlier, he was already older. So, defenseman Dougie Hamilton would make his debut at this time, and Tim Thomas is traded to the New York Islanders in February of 2013. Now, nothing comes of it. He refused to play for the Islanders, and his career was basically over. So, the Islanders they basically just traded him. The Bruins basically got a couple draft picks that turned into pretty much nothing for a guy that was not going to do anything for them anyway. In April of 2013, the team traded for right wing Jaromir Jagr. And right during this time is when the Boston Marathon bombing occurs. So it's just really, the city of Boston was rallied behind. For the rest of the country kind of rallied behind the Boston teams at this point. Everyone just wanted to see Boston do good. I do have a story for this. I don't know if I've mentioned this, but the very first professional game in Boston at this point, after the Boston Marathon bombing, was an NHL game between the Buffalo Sabres and the Boston Bruins. And my dad and my aunt had surprised us because both of our birthdays are around this time. So my aunt had surprised us both with tickets to go to that game. We had decent seats, and we went to that game. Of course, when we got the tickets, this was before the bombing occurred, so nobody had really expected anything. And we went to the game. It was my first Bruins game. It was my dad's first Bruins game in Boston. He had seen them play in Hartford. And it just, security was very tight, which made sense. And we went there, and it was just a very emotional game. The Sabres would end up winning that game. But, myself, as you guys know, I am not a fan of Boston teams. I was joining in the We Are Boston chants. Now, that's because I don't mind, obviously, you have to stay united. Terrorism is not good. Obviously, terrorism isn't good. But we had to be united. Everyone in that stadium was cheering We Are Boston. When the Sabres scored the game-winning goal, nobody really cheered. There were Sabre fans there, but they didn't cheer. They just kind of, clapped their hands and called it a day. I respected that, and that's what kind of made me feel different about Buffalo. I went from being indifferent towards, slightly favoring them. But the whole incident just kind of, it's something I'll never forget. So, thank you to my aunt for buying us the tickets for that game before it happened. But I had to mention that, something that I physically was a part of, physically at. I had videos of myself chanting, of the fans near me and myself chanting "We Are Boston" on Unfortunately, I lost the device that they were on. My dad didn't think to record any videos because, he didn't, his phone was a flip phone, I think, at that point. So he didn't think to do anything of it. We did call my aunt, and, she got to hear the chants firsthand, too. But it's just, it was a very, very emotional game for everybody. That just had to be mentioned. So, the Bruins would lose the Stanley Cup to the Blackhawks that year, though, with a 4-2 series. So, unfortunately for Boston, the Bruins didn't win the Stanley Cup. But they did get the Red Sox to win the World Series. So, right after that season, Jagr leaves. Jagr was not the best player. The stats were decent for the Bruins, but, he was very slow and sluggish if you watch the actual game tapes. So, the Bruins didn't lose that much. So they end up trading center Tyler Seguin to the Dallas Stars in the summer of 2013. They had a very strong season 2013-14, but lost in the second round of the playoffs. In the 14-15 season, right wing David Pastrnak, affectionately known as Pasta, makes his NHL debut. In the 14-15 season, though, the Bruins would miss the playoffs despite another stronger season. So in response, in June of 2015, they trade left wing Milan Lucic to the LA Kings. They then trade defenseman Dougie Hamilton later in the summer to the Calgary Flames. The Bruins were kind of like, okay, at this point, we have an older team. Let's just break it apart and go through a little bit of a quick rebuild here. The Bruins had a rough 15-16 season, but achieved the franchise's 3,000th career win versus the New Jersey Devils on January 8th, 2016. They would fire Claude Julien in February of 2017, and they promoted Bruce Cassidy to become the team's new head coach. They lost in the first round of the playoffs that year, and the 17-18 Bruins improved, but still lost in the playoffs, this time making it to the second round. The 2018-2019 Bruins made it to the Stanley Cup, but they lost to the St. Louis Blues in Game 7 of a very, very close series. It was one of the times I've actually been able to watch a Game 7 of a Stanley Cup, because normally I'm busy. I was able to watch it. I made sure I was able to watch it. So at this point in the NHL, before the COVID-19 pause, the Boston Bruins were, the best team in the NHL. They had the best record. When I wrote this, we had yet to hear about the playoffs, how they're going to work. So the Bruins right now are the 1 seed in the East. Of course, the round robin's going to happen in probably late July, early August. The Bruins have the most to lose as the 1 seed. They very well might drop to being the 4 seed, but we'll see what happens. The Bruins have a very good chance to win the Cup. I will mention it, of course, when the playoffs happen. We'll do videos discussing the playoffs, but at the moment they are, they have the best record in the NHL. So the Bruins, they made 3 Stanley Cups in that decade, winning one of them in the 2010-2011 season. So the Bruins have been to 20 Stanley Cups in their career, in their time, I should say, in their existence. And they've won 6 of them. So that's, of course you have to make 20 Stanley Cups to be able to say, yeah, we made 20 Stanley Cups. And, you lost 14, but you won 6. And there are so many teams that would love to have a Stanley Cup. Numerous teams would love to have a Stanley Cup in there. Have the banner hanging from their stadiums, from the roof. So 58 people with ties to the Bruins are in the Hall of Fame. And this does include guys like defenseman Paul Coffey, who spent 1 season on the Bruins. This does not include somebody like Jumbo Joe, who more likely than not will be in the Hall of Fame at some point soon, but isn't right now. So the Bruins have 12 retired numbers in the NHL. Now, just like baseball, one of these retired numbers is retired league round, and this one is going to be number 99, Wayne Gretzky. So, yeah, other than Wayne Gretzky, the Bruins have 11 of their own players retired. They have number 2, Eddie Shore, number 3, Lionel Hitchman, number 4, Bobby Orr, number 5, Dick Clapper, number 7, Phil Esposito, number 8, Cam Neely, number 9, Johnny Buckyuk, number 15, Milt Schmidt, number 16, Rick Middleton, number 24, Terry O'Reilly, and last but not least, number 77, Ray Bourque. So that sums up the Bruins. That's the Bruins history. As you saw, the Bruins, I didn't mention it, but they did have more rivalries with the Canadiens in the 2000s, 2010s. And again, the Canadiens more had their number. The Canadiens were the 8th seed and they upset the 1 seed Bruins one year, and then they were the 7th seed and they upset the 2 seeded Bruins one year. But in there was a chunk of time too where the Bruins were beating the Canadiens in the rivalry. Don't worry, we will be doing a rivalries segment as well. And of course, the Bruins Canadiens rivalry will be mentioned. It's going to be an interesting segment though. It's going to be different. The rivalry segment's going to be different than other segments that we've done in the past because, you'll see when we get to it. But it's very exciting. The Bruins, of course, they've been around, one of the original 6 teams. They were the first one to lose in the Stanley Cup final to a non-original 6 team, to an expansion club. They have their 6 Stanley Cups. They have plenty of big names, obviously. Esposito, Bobby Orr, Ray Bourque. So they have big names galore. They've had some very interesting coaches. They've only been in 3 stadiums. So, that's pretty impressive for a team that's been around for nearly 100 years. They've had some of the best guys in the NHL working for them. Art Ross. They've had their share of struggles. It's not like it's been smooth sailing for the Bruins, but, it's very cool. I've always enjoyed watching the Bruins play. I'm not a Bruins fan in any way, shape, or form, but I have enjoyed watching them play. They've had a lot of historical players on their team. So, yeah, that's the history of the Boston Bruins. This, again, was our second ever history of video, and the first one involving, an NHL team. So we are very, very pleased to do it. We have another 9 history of videos ready to be posted. I'm taking my time with, recording and posting them and all that. But, every Friday you will be getting a history of video. That's a promise, unless, something comes up and I'm really not feeling well. I will let you guys know beforehand, though. And I will try, in this upcoming time frame, in the summertime, I will try to get more videos up, of history of videos, I should say, up. It's going to take a little bit of time. It's not going to, it takes me a long amount of time to do research for these videos because I mentioned it before with the Twins. I don't just sit here and read off a screen. What I do is I manually do the research and I write it down because I'm more likely to remember something when I write it down, so I'm not jumping around going, oh, wait, So, yeah, I do apologize that I'm only putting one up a week right now. I like to do a dry run before I post them, so I make sure I'm reading them, making sure there's no errors. Sometimes I'll make an error. I do apologize for that. If you notice, feel free to let me know in the comments. Yeah, but that's it. That's the history of the Bruins. Shout out to hockeyreference.com for helping me. That's where I got a lot of these records and everything like that. But yeah, have a great day, everyone. Hope you're enjoying the day. Hope you're staying safe. Heartland Sports out.